As we continue to worship tonight, we're going to continue thinking about the sacrifice that Jesus has made for us. I want to invite you to continue contemplating the goodness of God and the sacrifice, the love that Jesus has for us. And we've read the accounts of that. We've read the story of Jesus' betrayal and arrest and crucifixion. For our devotion tonight, I want to zero in on an aspect of Jesus' experience, an aspect of Jesus' trials that is sometimes overlooked, but which I think will serve to help us consider what God has done for us in the work of Christ. And that is the repeated theme that we see in Jesus' trials of people abdicating any responsibility for what other people are dealing with. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that in just a minute. In effect, it's people saying, it's not my problem. It's not my problem. And actually, to begin to see that theme, I want to go back to a story earlier on in redemptive history, a story that doesn't usually get talked about at Good Friday or Easter time, but it's the story of Cain and Abel from Genesis chapter 4. You don't have to turn there in your Bibles. If you don't want to, you're welcome to, but I'm going to read to you these verses from Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel, and I'll explain how this connects with what we're considering about Jesus tonight. But I invite you, if you are so inclined, just to listen to the word of the Lord as it's read, and let the Holy Spirit minister to your hearts. Listen to these words from Genesis chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? It's a story that we know well, whether you've been in around church all your life or not. You're probably familiar with this story. It's one of those that's passed into the folklore of our culture. Cain and Abel. Cain murders his brother Abel. But why does Cain murder his brother Abel? The story tells us that Cain was angry. In fact, Cain was jealous of his brother Abel. And why was he jealous? Well, because the Lord had regard, it says, for Abel's offering and not for Cain's. And we asked the question, why was that? And there's different answers given, but I think the clue is found in the way Abel's offerings are described. Abel offered from the flocks the firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. It doesn't say anything about the type of offerings that Cain brought. I don't think the issue is what was brought as an offering to the Lord. I think the issue is the quality of what was brought and what that said about the individual hearts of those bringing them. Abel, by bringing the best of the flock, was showing that he had the highest regard for the Lord. He wanted to give the Lord his best. And Cain, by not bringing the best of his offerings, was showing that he had little regard for God. And so God had little regard for Cain's offering, and he had high regard for Abel's offering, and Cain was angry. And notice that when God speaks to Cain about this, he speaks to him gently, doesn't he? And he says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? In other words, this isn't an issue of favoritism between Cain and Abel. This is an issue of their hearts. God says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Cain had a negative view of God long before God had a negative regard for Cain, and it shows up in how they give their offerings. And Cain, instead of asking God to help him have the right regard for him, to change his heart, to give him faith, instead of doing that, Cain decides to solve the problem by murdering his brother. And then God comes to Cain, and he says, where is your brother? And you have to understand, in this exchange between God and Cain in these verses, God is not asking for information that he didn't have before. When he says, where is Abel, your brother? He knows where Abel is. Rather, what God is doing is giving to Cain an opportunity to come clean, isn't he? He's giving to Cain an opportunity to confess what's going on. And Cain, for his part, when he says, I don't know, Am I my brother's keeper? I suspect that Cain is not truly trying to deceive God. I have a hard time believing that Cain really thinks he has a chance of deceiving God. I think really what's going on here is that Cain is simply abdicating responsibility. When he says, am I my brother's keeper, that is precisely what he's doing, isn't it? He's saying, I don't know where Abel is, but what I do know is it's not my problem. It's not my problem. It's less an outright lie as it is a denial of ultimate responsibility. And in that sense, he's not acting unlike his parents, is he? You go back a chapter and see Adam and Eve in their fall from grace. They also, when confronted by God with their sin, instead of coming clean immediately, they also abdicate responsibility. They point fingers. They try to come up with reasons why. It's not their fault. It's not their problem. And Cain is doing the same thing. Cain is saying, essentially, what happened to Abel isn't my problem. I'm not responsible for him. I'm not my brother's keeper. It's not my problem. It's this abdication of responsibility that I want to zero in on here. Because I think we see it not only here, but we see it throughout the sins of humanity, throughout the Bible, and we see it in particular in the story of the trials of Jesus that we just read about and that we are familiar with. We see it in a couple of different places in the story of Jesus' trials. Consider the reaction of the chief priests to Judas in Matthew's gospel. Let me read to you these verses from Matthew chapter 27, verse 3. It says, when Judas, Jesus' betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. Now, who knows what exactly the course of Judas' remorse takes? But what I think he is saying to the religious leaders is essentially, I'm identifying with my father Cain. I'm identifying with my ancestor. I also have betrayed my brother. I am guilty of his blood. I have betrayed innocent blood. Judas is a tragic figure in the story, isn't he? Can you feel the weight of Judas' guilt? And just let yourself feel that for just a minute. The weight of his guilt. The weight of his unspoken request here. He clearly wants absolution of some kind. He wants the chief priests to tell him something that will make him feel better. He wants an avenue to make things right or some kind of reassurance that they were doing the right thing. All of that is between the lines of what Judas is saying here as he returns the 30 pieces of silver, or tries to. But how do the chief priests respond to him? What is that to us? See to that yourself. Now understand, of course, the Hebrew priesthood is not like what developed in the Roman Catholic priesthood over the years. They couldn't offer for Judas to step into a confessional and receive some kind of formal absolution, as happens in Catholic understanding. But they could have taken Judas's expression of shame and remorse, maybe as one final red flag, that what they were doing was wicked and unjust. They could have said, you know what, if this traitor is having second thoughts, maybe we should slow things down just a little bit. They could have done that. They could have listened to Judas in that moment and agreed that they were all complicit in betraying innocent blood. It wasn't yet too late. They could have stopped it, right? Short of this, they could at least have offered Judas some kind of reassurance that they were doing the right thing. And of course, that would have been a lie. It would have been wrong, misunderstanding what was going on. Their reassurance in that moment would have been mistaken, but at least it would have demonstrated a kind of camaraderie of traitors or something. But instead, they say to Judas essentially the same thing that Cain said to God. What you're dealing with isn't our problem, they say to him. It's not our problem. You and your feelings of guilt or shame or remorse, they're not our responsibility. It's not our problem. You aren't our problem. See to it yourself. What is it to us? It's not our problem. And then strikingly, Pilate says almost the same thing, word for word. as he speaks to the crowds about Jesus a little bit later. In Matthew 27, verse 24, it says, "When Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and he washed his hands." The famous scene in the story of Jesus' trials, isn't it? He washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Pilate was the Roman governor. You must understand, Pilate was not a Jewish ruler. He was appointed by the Roman Empire to oversee what happened in that area of the world. He was the enforcer of the Lex Romana, the Roman law. He was the representative of the law of Rome, and he was an outsider to the religious squabbles of the Jewish people. And as such, I think he was able to see with more clarity what was going on here. He understood that Jesus was being railroaded, and as you read the story in Matthew 27 and the other Gospels, it becomes clear that Pilate tries to slow things down. Pilate tries to get Jesus released because he understands that this is a miscarriage of justice. There's several places where you see Pilate trying to do that. And you must understand, I think, too, that Pilate's reasons for wanting to get Jesus released, while certainly multifaceted, are based primarily in the fact that the Romans had a very serious view of the law. They were unheard of. Their commitment to the law was unheard of in previous empires. They were remarkably even-handed. I mean, there was still corruption and bribery and dishonesty there in the Roman Empire, just as there is in every large world power. But as compared to the Greeks and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Egyptians and other world powers of the day, the Romans were remarkable for their commitment to law and justice. If you want evidence of that, all you have to do is look back at the founding of our own country and understand who our forefathers looked at when they were drafting the foundational documents for our country. They read predominantly the Roman philosophers and political thinkers. So Pilate has this desire to see the law followed. He has in him this aversion to justice being thwarted. And yet, in Pilate's heart, there is a greater commitment even than the commitment to the Lex Romana, the law of Rome, and that is his commitment to the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. You see, the one most important job of every Roman governor in that day and age was to make sure that the peace was maintained, to make sure that riots didn't break out, to make sure that uprisings didn't happen, to make sure that the Roman legions didn't have to come through and wipe out populations, because the Roman Senate and the Roman emperors knew that that was the quickest way to make people angry, and so they kept everything low-key. And so Pilate makes a few efforts to try to get Jesus released. But as it says here, when he sees that he's gaining nothing, when he sees that nothing is happening, and that instead a riot is breaking out, what does he do? He washes his hands of the whole situation. And he says to the crowds the same thing that the priests said to Judas, the same thing which in essence I think Cain says to God. It's not my problem. It's not my problem. See to it yourself. He is saying, in essence, this isn't my problem. I am not taking responsibility for Jesus' death. The blood of this man will stain us, and so I don't want anything to do with it. He washes his hands. It's not my problem. Jesus, Pilate says, is not my problem. It's not my problem. I wonder how often those words are used either explicitly or implicitly as a justification for ignoring what's wrong with the world. We're all guilty of saying those words or something like them at some time. Indeed, I think in these three stories that we've just recounted for you tonight, we're all represented equally. We are all Cain, choosing to tear down our fellow human beings out of jealousy rather than repenting of our own sinful actions. We are all the chief priests, choosing to ignore the pain of our fellow humans as long as we get what we want. We are all Pilate, choosing to shut our eyes to injustice as long as our world stays secure. These things, we say to ourselves, they're just not our problem. It's not my problem. And yet there is a problem still. Even though Cain said it wasn't his problem, Abel's blood still cried out from the ground. Even though the priests said that Judas's guilt wasn't their problem, Judas's guilt still remained. Though Pilate said it wasn't his problem, Jesus' blood still stained his hands. Saying that it's not our problem doesn't change the facts. Saying it's not my problem doesn't fix things. What we need is someone who refuses to ignore the problem. What we need is someone who chooses to solve the problem. What we need is someone who chooses to say, this is my problem and I will fix it. And that brings us to Jesus himself, doesn't it? Jesus, instead of saying, like Cain, am I my brother's keeper, says, I will be my brother's keeper. I will determine what my brother most needs, and I will provide it for him, even though it cost me my life. Jesus says, I will go out of my way to take care of my brothers and sisters. I will travel from the courts of heaven, from the loftiness of divine essence, and enter into the messiness of humanity. I will take my brother's problems as my own. I will be my brother's keeper. Jesus, instead of saying, like the priests, what is your guilt to me? See to it yourself. Jesus says, your guilt is everything to me. I will move heaven and earth to remove your burden of guilt. You just sit and rest, Jesus says. I will see to it. I'll take care of it. Jesus, instead of saying like Pilate, I wash my hands of this, I am clean and innocent of this guilt. Jesus says, here, I will willingly embrace this guilt. I am innocent and clean, but for your sake I will become dirty and guilty. That's the crucifixion. That's what the crucifixion is about, isn't it? That's why we gather together on a Friday night of all times to consider the price that Jesus pays for us, to consider the love that God has for us, because Jesus alone of all humanity has said, I will see to it. This is my problem. I will deal with it for you. We could spend time detailing the physical pain that Jesus experienced on the cross. And indeed, I don't think that's a bad thing to do sometimes, to consider the physical torture that Jesus endured. It's a good symbol, a good reminder of the heinousness of sin and the cost of God's love. But understand, all of the physical torture that Jesus experienced, all of the pain that he endured, all of it is merely a symbol of the deeper spiritual pain of separation from his Father. As we read earlier, my God, Jesus says, why have you forsaken me? This was the true cost that Jesus paid. This was the true pain that he endured. He took our guilt, our sin, our shame, so that we could be saved. Jesus alone of all humanity says, this is my problem. I will see to it. Jesus has solved the problem that has plagued humanity right from the start. Jesus alone has chosen not to abdicate responsibility. Jesus has taken it all upon himself.